I'm 103 years old, and most people are wrong about what war takes from you. They think it steals years. What it really takes is something far more dangerous, because you don't notice it's gone until your life is already built around its absence. I survived the war, but I didn't come back whole. And if you're listening to this thinking it doesn't concern you, that's exactly how it starts. I was 18 when I entered the war, and when I came out, I was older than my age, in ways that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with what happens when survival becomes your only task. There are losses you can name, like freedom, safety, and innocence. But there are others that take decades to recognize, losses that live quietly inside you, shaping how you move through the world, how you relate to others, and what you allow yourself to feel. For a long time, I didn't know what had been taken from me, because I was alive, functioning, building a life. And when you survive something extreme, survival itself can feel like proof that everything else is intact. It takes many years to understand that you can keep going and still be missing something essential, and it takes even longer to accept that some wounds do not announce themselves with pain, but with absence. At 103, I don't look back at the war as a chapter that made me strong. I look at it as the moment that quietly shaped the man I became, in ways I did not choose and could not undo. I was 18 years old when the war took me, and at that age you don't yet understand the difference between courage and obedience. Because when you are young, you follow orders not because you believe in them deeply, but because refusing does not feel like an option that truly exists. I became a soldier before I had learned how to be a man, and almost immediately after, I became something else entirely, a prisoner of war captured in Hong Kong on Christmas Day in 1941, a moment that split my life into a before and an after that never quite reconnected. From the outside, people imagine captivity as a single event, a period you endure and then leave behind. But from the inside, it becomes a way of existing, where every movement, every word, every expression is measured against the constant threat of punishment, and where survival depends not on bravery, but on restraint. For 4 years, my world shrank to routines designed to keep the body alive while the mind learned to disappear. Because when you live under the possibility of violence at any moment, you quickly understand that emotions are dangerous, that showing fear, anger, or resistance can cost you everything. So you adapt, you make yourself smaller, you make yourself quieter, you learn not to react. That kind of adaptation is effective because it keeps you alive. But it comes with a cost that no one explains to you when you're young. A cost that doesn't appear immediately, and that follows you long after the danger has passed. I survived those years not because I was stronger than others, but because I learned how to shut parts of myself down. And at the time, that felt like success. Because survival rewards whatever works, even if what works slowly erases something human inside you. When the war finally ended and I was released, I walked back into the world believing I was free again, without realizing that the habits that had kept me alive were still shaping me, quietly, invisibly, in ways I would only begin to understand decades later. Living as a prisoner of war teaches you a very specific way of existing, one where the goal is not progress, fulfillment, or even hope, but simply making it to the next day without attracting attention, without giving anyone a reason to notice you too closely. Over time, survival becomes mechanical, almost mathematical, because you begin to understand which behaviors keep you safe and which ones invite danger. And slowly, without realizing it, you start editing yourself down to the smallest possible version that can still function. You eat when food is available, not when you are hungry. You sleep when exhaustion allows it, not when you feel rested. You move when ordered, not when your body wants to move. And somewhere inside that routine, emotion becomes a liability, because feeling too much makes you careless. And carelessness can cost you everything. I watched men much stronger than me disappear, not because they lacked physical endurance, but because something inside them refused to shut down, refused to accept the narrowing of life to pure survival. And that refusal, admirable as it may sound, was often what broke them. So I learned to do the opposite. I learned to flatten myself emotionally, to keep my thoughts small and contained, to avoid imagining futures that might never arrive, because hope, when it is repeatedly disappointed, becomes another form of suffering. At the time, this felt like discipline. It felt like intelligence. It felt like adaptation. What I could not see then was that the longer you live this way, the more natural it becomes, and the more difficult it is to remember how to exist differently once the circumstances change. When the war ended and I was released, my body walked back into the world. But part of me was still operating under the rules of captivity, measuring safety, danger, and closeness through instincts that had kept me alive, but were never meant to guide an ordinary life. And it would take many years before I understood that surviving the war was only the first part of the journey, because learning how to live afterward required unlearning things I didn't even know I had taught myself. What the war took from me was not my ability to function, to work, or to build a life on the surface, but something far less visible and far more difficult to explain, because when you learn to survive by shutting emotion down, reopening it later is not a simple decision, it is a skill you may no longer possess. When I came out of captivity, I was still young in years, but emotionally I was different from other men my age. Not because I was wiser or stronger, but because I had learned that showing feeling had once been dangerous, and habits formed under threat do not dissolve simply because the threat is gone. For 4 years, any display of anger, fear, or vulnerability could have consequences, so I trained myself not to feel them openly, not to let them rise to the surface. And over time that restraint became automatic, almost instinctive, as natural as breathing. The problem is that the same restraint that keeps you safe in captivity also distances you from others in ordinary life, because intimacy requires exposure, and exposure had once meant danger. I did not lack affection. I lacked access to it. There were gaps inside me where certain emotions should have lived, not because I chose to remove them, but because they had been set aside for so long that I no longer knew how to reach them. People around me could sense it, even if they couldn't name it, and I could sense their disappointment without fully understanding why, because from my perspective I was present, reliable and committed, while from theirs something essential was missing. It took me a long time to realize that emotional numbness is not the absence of feeling, but the result of feeling too much for too long without safety, until the system simply shuts parts of itself down to survive. And by the time safety returns, the system does not automatically reset. Love, for me, was never something I doubted intellectually, but it was something I struggled to inhabit fully, because while I could commit, remain loyal, and build a shared life, there were parts of emotional closeness that stayed just out of reach, as if a door inside me had been quietly closed long before I understood it mattered. I had a marriage, a long one, nearly half a century together, and from the outside it looked solid, dependable, even happy in many ways. Yet I know now that there were moments when my inability to express what was needed created distance, not through cruelty or neglect, but through absence. The truth is that during the war, I cured myself of something, or at least that is how it felt at the time, because caring too deeply had once been dangerous, and love, when it makes you vulnerable, can feel like a risk you cannot afford when survival depends on control. So I learned to manage relationships the same way I had learned to manage danger, by staying composed, contained and careful, without realizing that love does not thrive under those conditions, because love requires a softness that cannot be forced back into existence once it has been suppressed for too long. I do not say this with bitterness, but with clarity, because looking back, I can see how my limitations affected not only the women who loved me, but myself as well, since every relationship reflects what we are able to give and what we are able to receive. There are regrets that come from doing harm, and there are regrets that come from not knowing how to offer something essential. And the second kind can be just as heavy, because it leaves you wondering not what you did wrong, but what you never learned how to do at all. If there is one quiet lesson here, it is that what keeps you alive at one stage of life can quietly limit you at another, and unless it is examined, it follows you into places it was never meant to go. Living this long has taught me that longevity itself is not a reward, and it is certainly not a guarantee of happiness, because continuing to exist only has meaning if you remain inwardly engaged with the world as it changes around you. Many people assume that reaching an advanced age means slowing down in every sense, but what truly keeps you alive is not preserving the body alone. It is preserving interest, curiosity, and a willingness to stay mentally present, even when the world no longer resembles the one you were born into. I have never taken medication, not because I avoided illness entirely, but because I stayed active for as long as I could, using my body, my hands, and my mind to build things, to create furniture, to paint, and to remain connected to the physical reality around me. Because once you stop using yourself, you begin to disappear long before life actually ends. What people call luck plays a role, of course, because accidents, timing, and birth are not things we control, but there is also something quieter at work, something that has nothing to do with discipline or optimism, and everything to do with remaining interested in existence itself. I have seen many people live long lives and suffer through them, not because life was cruel, but because they had lost any sense of engagement with what was still unfolding. And without that engagement, time becomes something you endure rather than inhabit. For me, the difference was always attention, the simple decision to remain curious about how the world works, how it changes, and how humanity continues to repeat its patterns, sometimes learning, sometimes failing to do so. Interest, I have learned, is not a luxury. It is a form of survival, and without it, living longer can become an unbearable weight instead of a continuation worth carrying. At 103, if there is one thing I have come to accept, it is that life does not follow a moral arc, it does not reward effort fairly, and it does not correct itself simply because we hope it will, because existence is shaped as much by accident as it is by intention. People often ask me what message I would leave behind, what truth I would want the world to remember. And the uncomfortable answer is that humanity has always believed it was learning, always believed the next generation would do better, and yet we repeat the same patterns with more powerful tools and greater consequences. I've lived through 2 world wars, I've seen unimaginable destruction, and I've watched humanity rebuild only to place itself again at the edge of something equally dangerous. Not because we lack intelligence, but because truth and responsibility are fragile when fear and power take their place. For most of my life, I believed that honesty and honor were fundamental human traits, things we could rely on even in difficult times. But in recent years, I have watched truth become flexible, optional, and disposable, and that realization has made me more cautious about the future than I ever expected to be. Still, pessimism alone serves no purpose. What matters now is awareness. If I could speak to my younger self, knowing everything I know today, I would not try to rewrite the past or pretend that regret can be undone, because that kind of thinking is useless, but I would tell him to stay attentive, to notice what is happening inside himself and inside the world before damage becomes irreversible. I have lost a son, and that loss taught me that understanding always arrives too late if we are not paying attention while it still matters, because knowledge gained after the fact cannot save what has already been lost. If you are listening to this now, I do not offer comfort or easy hope, but I offer responsibility, the responsibility to remain conscious, curious, and honest, even when it is uncomfortable, because the future is not shaped by optimism alone, but by whether people are willing to face reality without turning away. I do not know if the world will be okay. What I do know is that what happens next depends less on time and more on whether those who are still young choose to stay awake while there is still something left to protect.